I will say that it's really strange to hear a Hamas representative speaking from Turkey, of all places. He's nowhere near the fighting. The others are in Qatar, far away from the fighting, living it up in fancy hotels. The people of Gaza are the ones who are suffering, and their leaders aren't serving them well. I think I would disagree a bit with what Sayeeda said, that I don't think there is an equivalence between the people of Israel's feelings on what's going on and the people of Gaza's, because I think the people of Israel, when I've been out there reporting on it, are very clear that the aggression that took place on October the 7th was so brutal and extreme that it needs a response which will ensure that Israel has a level of security in the future. And that's why I think Benjamin Netanyahu...
So how is that different to the feelings of the people in Gaza?
Well, I think that the difference is that in saying that both sides have had enough of their leadership fighting, I think Israelis haven't had enough of their leadership continuing a war to keep them safe.
See, I disagree with you on that. I think if you look at the daily protests against Netanyahu, if you look at the protests and the accusations against Netanyahu,
the vast majority of the Israeli population want to continue the war until it's over. I mean, that's shown in almost all polling. And I think despite the divisions in Israel and despite Netanyahu's unpopularity over the last year or so, they've actually united very squarely behind the war.
Let me come back on this, Jonathan. So, three things. First of all, I think there is clear opposition to Netanyahu. It was there before the war. It's still there. And there are people on a daily basis protesting, particularly the hostages' family, who believe that Netanyahu and many of his ministers have not taken the issue of hostages seriously. And there have been clear comments from these ministers which show that actually hostages are not important. Secondly, there's been criticism of Netanyahu that his son is living it up, a bit like the Hamas leaders elsewhere, and isn't on the ground.
Well, his son isn't an elected official.
Doing his bit.
We don't look at the son of the Prime Minister and criticise him in this country.
Doing his bit in the way that lots of young Israelis are doing. And thirdly, some of the strongest voices that are coming out of Israel are the voices of those communities that were attacked so brutally at the beginning of October, who are saying, do not weaponise our grief and do not go in and kill more people.
I don't know which survivors you've been talking to, because I've interviewed lots of survivors from the kibbutzim who are adamant that despite the lives they lived... this man that you interviewed, he used to be the Minister of Health under the Hamas government, so he will be entirely familiar with the volunteers from the kibbutzim who used to drive Palestinians from Gaza to Israeli hospitals for treatment. Yahya Sinwar had a brain cancer operation in Israel. These people have benefited under his time as Minister of Health from Israeli healthcare.
You know, you talk about the hostage families. Well, what about the hostage families who are protesting, who are storming the Knesset, who are demanding that more be done to get their family members home?
Undoubtedly, if any of us were in their position, I'm sure we too would want anything done to release the hostages. And there are, incidentally, hostage families who aren't protesting. They're quiet because they have faith in the government. Whether the government is doing enough...
But then the faith in the government is also being questioned by Israel's staunchest allies. The United States, the UK are saying the level of killing...
I think what we need, really... So, effectively, I think the problem here is that if we criticise a democratic country that is trying to deal with a security threat, which was so massive, what happened on October the 7th happened, we need to have a better solution. And I don't think anyone is suggesting one, whether it's the unelected Lord Cameron, our Foreign Secretary, or whether it's Joe Biden. There is nobody saying exactly what would remove this threat from Israel's border. It's on the doorstep.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is if Netanyahu is the best option for Israel, honestly, my heart weeps for Israelis. There has to be
any Prime Minister in Israel would be conducting this war now.
Sorry, go ahead.
You've got to let me speak.
Sorry,
I don't like interrupting. I don't like being interrupted. Basically, there has to be a better option. There are thousands that took to the streets in Israel.
What is it? What is the better option?
Sorry, just,
Jonathan, you've got to let me speak. I don't operate like this. I don't interrupt.
Sorry,
I don't like being interrupted. So, Jonathan, there were thousands that took to the streets who basically said, before even this war started, that Netanyahu was wrong for Israel. There were people who stood outside Downing Street when he last came to the United Kingdom saying this man is bad for Israel, he's bad for Israelis, he's definitely bad for Palestinians. And I think the quicker people who consider themselves to be friends of Israel realise that they do not have to be friends of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu is not a friend of Israel, the better it will be for the future of a secure Israeli state.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected as their Prime Minister. He was very unpopular before the war broke out. I think that despite the protests that were going on for months about judicial reform in Israel, actually the country swung quite squarely behind him and the war effort. And I do think that virtually any Prime Minister of Israel at this moment would be conducting a pretty similar war, and that's why there's been... Well, there aren't clear voices within Israel, in Israeli politics, who are contradicting the idea of continuing the war in order to eliminate the Hamas threat. And while there is still battalions of Hamas left, then there's bound to be a pretty unified opinion in Israel. Of course, the hostages complicate it, because the hostages are the Israeli civilians who were kidnapped, the ones that were raped, beheaded, live streamed on the internet for their families to have to go through the horror of watching. Those people, well, let's say the hostage families are the lucky ones, because theirs are perhaps still alive in Gaza. I think that all of those people, understandably, want the hostages returned, and there are people who are critical of Netanyahu not doing enough. But the war is entirely supported.
I've just got to say, look, war is not the answer. There were two objectives that Israel had at the beginning of this, before 30,000 people were killed. One was the return of the hostages, and the second was to eliminate Hamas. Neither of those objections have been satisfied, and they have killed 30,000 people are now dead. We have to stop this. We cannot carry on. Those military objections of Israel are not being met, and there is too much human suffering. And I sincerely hope that people like you and others will be encouraging people within Israel to say we have to have a deal, and all of us will be saying on all parties saying we have to have a deal. We have to bring this to an end.
Baroness Warsi, Jonathan, we'll move on to the next segment, but we will have you back on later on in the programme. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come, on the front line of a drugs war.